Welcome to week 9 of ESPS0015 Political Economy. What do these two guys have in common? Well, they are American presidents, Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. They are two of only 4 American presidents who didn't get re-elected, who only won 1 term in office. But they are also both casualties of economic conditions, of a recession, an economic downturn. And in the 1992 election, who beat Bush? Well, people maybe remember reading about it. This is Bill Clinton, of course. And in his war room, in his sort of campaign office, there was a board with these kinds of notes on it. And the second one you can read here, "The economy is stupid." It's the economy stupid is one of the slogans that one of Clinton's sort of campaign strategists, James Carville, sort of coined during the 1992 elections. That basically, elections, American presidential elections, but in reality many other elections, are to some extent decided by the economic conditions. Bush was not generally unpopular. He had just won the Iraq War, but the recession basically killed his re-election chances. And this general idea, the idea that economic conditions, whether the economy is in a growth period or in recession, whether there's high unemployment or employment for everyone, whether there's maybe high inflation, those kinds of economic conditions matter for whether incumbents or incumbent parties get re-elected or not. And this idea that there's this relationship is what is known as economic voting. And this idea of economic voting is a strong sort of established empirical regularity in political science. So we'll look at some data. Then we think about a little bit about theory, about principal agent models, and then at the end we talk about sort of challenges to the model as it stands. Anecdotally, lots of people, of course, were aware of a relationship between sort of economic conditions, how things are going, and presidential vote shares, for example, or sort of the re-election prospects of incumbents way before modern political science and economics sort of started looking at it. But in the 1970s, the first sort of systematic studies of this emerged, and these were people like Kramer and Mueller and Hibbs, who basically looked at, for the most part, sort of presidential elections and looked at sort of the economic conditions and how that affects the chances of presidents or parties winning further terms in office. Basically, this spawned, of course, an enormous sort of literature that we see today on sort of economic voting. And the Bread and Peace model that we have here on the right, this is the Hibbs model, is one of the sort of early examples and one that has sort of also been used sort of throughout the decades, really. And it's a very, very simple model, so that's why it's nice to look at for us. So you should all be familiar by now with the sort of basic logic of these regression models, etc. What do we have here on the x-axis? Well, on the x-axis, we have basically the weighted average annualized per capita real income growth. So this is a measure of per capita income growth. So how much better are people off in terms of average incomes over the term, over the years preceding the election. So there's a lot of work basically looking at, okay, so is it about the whole term, about 4 years, or is it just sort of the last year, the latest information that influences people's choices, but that's not so important ultimately for us. But basically we have a measure of economic performance on the x-axis, income growth, and we have the incumbent party's vote share of the two-party vote on the y-axis. And we get this really, really strong relationship. So this is all American elections from 1952, presidential elections from 1952 to 2012. And we see this really strong relationship basically between sort of income growth, economic performance, individual economic performance, if you want, and the incumbent party vote share. So either the president's re-election chances personally, or the chance that the same party gets to put a second or third president into office. And so we see a strong relationship. So this, of course, uses economic growth, But there's other economic measures that are sometimes used. Sometimes people look at unemployment rates. Sometimes back in the day also people looked at inflation. So we can sort of think about which economic indicators are important, or we could integrate them into some sort of general sort of economic performance indicator. What else though matters, of course? If you think about sort of incumbents' re-election chances as sort of a dependent on performance, of course, we can think about other things that matter than just the economy. Many things potentially, but there's also events, of course, that influence these outcomes. And one of the big sort of questions, of course, for American presidents is the question of war, is the question of casualties, for example. And so we see these two exceptions to the rule here. We see Vietnam and Korean wars, where basically you have sort of large number of casualties coming back, and the presidents that sort of presided over this period performing less well in terms of their in terms of their vote share than would have been expected based on economic performance alone, because people don't just care about sort of how well they're doing in terms of economic performance, but perhaps also in terms of casualties. And so this is something that has to be taken into account. And some of these models, of course, were also designed to provide forecasting tools for elections. So this bread and peace model, for example, is every election cycle kind of used as one of the forecasting models for American presidential elections. And the nice thing about these kinds of models is that they're based on fundamentals. They're based on theoretical foundations. People hold presidents account or the parties to account for economic performance or war casualties, for example. So they're based on sort of theoretically appealing things compared to like polls, which are not theoretically informative, of course, and they are basically robust to sort of problems regarding polling, etc. So they are fundamental models of election forecasting. And this, of course, has been extended to many, many country contexts. At the same time as these sort of first American models were developed, there was Goodhart and Bonsali for the UK. It's kind of doing the same thing for Britain, and the US and the UK are sort of the two most researched probably countries, but it has been extended to many, many other country contexts of France and Germany and so forth and so forth. And there's also cross-national work, which we'll look at in a second. But if you want to think about think about your essay topics, perhaps sort of looking at economic voting in one of the less sort of established cases could be fun. The empirical case that probably many of you are most familiar with, of course, is the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The economic downturn that ensued sort of affected many countries, and sort of in some countries, of course, you had sort of the European debt crisis sort of continuing. So a lot of governments basically fell victim to this scenario. And on the right here we have a graph from Bartel's 2013 that basically looks at the sort of GDP growth in the 2 years before the election and the government, the incumbent party's vote share, or the change in the incumbent party's vote share on the y-axis in the first election following the financial crisis. And we see the same pattern. So incumbent governments get punished for bad economic conditions. So we're kind of all aware of this. But this graph, and also the question of sort of what happens in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, raises an interesting question. So, individual governments, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, were perhaps not really responsible for it. They couldn't really do anything. They happened to be in office when sort of the American housing market collapsed and sort of banks went bankrupt and sort of this whole sort of cataclysm happened. But they're not necessarily responsible for this, but they may be responsible, of course, in terms of the response to the crisis and what kind of policies get implemented. And that's the same for the coronavirus. So the fact that the pandemic happened will probably not, lead to sort of punishment of governments, but the response to it will matter for sure. But so the question of what is this responsibility? Why would voters hold governments responsible for those kind of conditions? Is of course what motivates us sort of theoretically here. So let's look a little bit at sort of a theoretical background for this. And the models that we look at here are principal agent models.